It happened in an instant. One gunshot, and an 18-year-old college freshman's life was stolen by the boy she once trusted most. Her name was Katina Solano. She had just started her first year at the University of the Pacific, excited to chase her dream of becoming a dentist. Instead, she was found bleeding from the head, abandoned on a campus pathway, her future cut short by a single act of violence. The man responsible was not a stranger lurking in the dark. It wasn't some faceless predator hiding in the shadows. It was Stephen Burns, the boy from across the street, the one who had been welcomed into her home, treated like family, mentored by her father, and loved by her younger sisters as a big brother figure. That betrayal, that unimaginable twist of trust turning into terror, is what still haunts Kina's family more than 4 decades later. But before we get there, let's go back to the beginning. Because to understand the depth of this tragedy, we need to see who Kina was, the family that loved her, and how a relationship that started with high school crushes turned into a deadly obsession. Kina grew up in San Francisco in the 1960s and 70s, the middle daughter in a close-knit family. Her parents, Mike and Harriet, built a warm home filled with faith, tradition, and love. Summers were spent in the mountains, sisters laughing and playing, with Kina often leading the way. She was kind, outgoing, and protective, the type of person everyone felt lucky to know. By the time she reached high school, Kina was a standout, bright, athletic, and popular. She was ready for the world. But across the street lived the Burns family, and among them was Stephen, a boy who seemed charming, talented, and driven. Their lives would soon intertwine in ways no one could have predicted. This is the story of a young woman's promising life, of a family forever scarred, and of a decades-long fight for justice that still hasn't ended. And it all began with a love story that seemed innocent, until it wasn't. The Solano family seemed like the picture of stability. Mike and Harriet weren't just parents. They were mentors in their San Francisco community, working as juvenile commissioners and opening their arms to young people who needed guidance. Their 3 daughters, Regina, Kina, and Nina, grew up surrounded by love, laughter, and a strong sense of faith. Kina, the middle child, was the glue of the family. She was protective of her sisters, ambitious in school, and a natural leader on the basketball and volleyball courts. Everyone who knew her remembers the same thing, her kindness. She was the kind of person who left people better than she found them. Then came the Burns family. They moved in across the street, with children close in age to the Solano sisters. What started with a shy exchange of homemade cookies turned into a neighborhood friendship. And before long, Kina and Stephen, the second oldest Burns boy, grew close. By high school, the two were inseparable. Stephen was tall, athletic, and charismatic. He was captain of his football team at a Catholic boys' school, while Kina excelled in sports at her own. They were the golden couple in the eyes of their friends. And to the Solanos, Stephen was almost like another son. Mike, Kina's father, even gave Stephen a job at his television store and treated him like family, partly because Stephen's relationship with his own father was strained. To the outside world, it looked like a sweet teenage romance. But behind the charm, cracks were starting to show. Stephen had a controlling streak that no one quite recognized for what it was at the time. When Kina began thinking about her future, dreaming of college, independence, and a career in dentistry, she started pulling away. And Stephen didn't like that. By senior year, Kina was ready to end things. She confided to her sister that Stephen had threatened her. If she left him, he said he would kill her. At the time, the sisters brushed it off, thinking it was teenage drama. Just angry words said in the heat of the moment. They never told their parents. That silence, that hesitation to share what they thought was just an empty threat, would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Because soon Kina would leave for college, and Stephen would follow. September 1979. It was supposed to be the start of everything Kina had worked for. She had just moved into her dorm at the University of the Pacific. She was excited, focused, and determined to become a dentist. Her future stretched out in front of her. But she wasn't free of Stephen Burns. Not yet. To Kina's shock, Stephen enrolled at the same university. What should have been a fresh start quickly turned into fear. For the first time, Kina turned to her father for help. Mike confronted Stephen directly, telling him, "Leave Kina alone. Respect her decision. Move on with your life." Stephen agreed on the surface, but his actions said otherwise. His new roommate later recalled that Stephen's side of the dorm was covered in photos of Kina. Not just one or two, but dozens. To him, their relationship wasn't over. It was something he clung to, obsessively. On September 11th, just days after classes began, Stephen knocked on Kina's dorm room door. He asked her to meet him later that evening one last time. Her roommate, Joanne, remembers Kina's unease. She didn't want to go, but she hoped it would finally be the end, that if she saw him one last time he would stop. Around 7:45 p.m., Kina left with Stephen. Joanne wished her a good night. Kina smiled nervously and said she'd be back later. She never returned. At 9:45 p.m., a freshman student walking near a remote part of campus stumbled upon something horrifying. It was Kina, lying on the ground, bleeding from the back of her head. She had been shot at close range. While students scrambled to get help, Stephen calmly returned to his dorm room. His roommate found him lying on the bed, watching Monday Night Football like nothing had happened. Not nervous, not shaken, just normal. Kina was rushed to the hospital, but the wound was catastrophic. Hours later, her parents got the call no parent ever wants to hear. Their daughter was gone. And yet, at that moment, Stephen wasn't behind bars. The murder weapon had disappeared. Without the gun, the police didn't have enough evidence to hold him. He was released into the care of his father, free to walk away while Kina's family prepared to bury their daughter. But Harriet Solano, Kina's mother, didn't need evidence to know the truth. In her heart, she knew it was Stephen. It was always Stephen. In the days after Kina's murder, the Solano family was trapped in a fog of grief and shock. Their daughter, their sister, was gone, and the boy who had been like family to them was walking free. At first, the case against Stephen seemed fragile. The missing gun left investigators with no physical weapon to tie him directly to the crime. But then, the pieces began to fall into place. Detectives spoke with Kina's sisters. That's when they learned about the threats, the chilling warning Stephen had made to Kina. "If you leave me, I'll kill you." For Regina and Nina, telling police about it was agonizing. The words echoed in their heads as an unbearable what if. What if they had taken him seriously? What if they had told their parents sooner? Could Kina have been saved? Their father, Mike, carried his own guilt. He had trusted Stephen, given him work, welcomed him into their home. He believed he should have protected Kina better. That sense of failure never left him. Investigators also discovered something even darker. Weeks before Kina's murder, Stephen had stolen a gun from Mike Solano's very own television store, where he worked part-time. The evidence suggested planning, not impulse. This wasn't a fight that got out of hand. This was an obsession spiraling toward a deadly end. And then came an even more chilling memory. The night before Kina left for college, her sister had seen Stephen pacing outside their home with something wrapped in a white towel. At the time, she wasn't sure what it was. Looking back, she was convinced it was the gun. The realization was terrifying. Stephen might have been planning to hurt Kina even before she moved to campus. 6 months later, Stephen Burns went on trial for Kina's murder. For the Solano family, the process was devastating. To make matters worse, the system seemed stacked in favor of the accused. Neither Mike nor Harriet were allowed inside the courtroom, not even when their youngest daughter, just 14 years old, was forced to testify about the threats she had overheard. It was painful, it was humiliating, and it was cruel. But despite everything, the jury reached a verdict. Guilty of second-degree murder. Stephen Burns was sentenced to 17 years to life. For the Solanos it wasn't enough, but at least they believed he would never walk free again. Or so they thought. When the gavel came down in 1980, sentencing Stephen Burns to 17 years to life, the Solano family clung to the last word. Life. They believed it meant Stephen would never again walk the streets, never again be able to harm another young woman. But a bitter truth soon surfaced. 17 years to life didn't mean life without parole. It meant that after serving a minimum number of years, Stephen could start petitioning for freedom. And that reality came crashing down far sooner than anyone expected. In 1990, just 10 years into his sentence, Stephen Burns became eligible for parole. For the Solano family, it was like ripping open a wound that had barely begun to scar. They had buried their daughter, struggled through trial, and tried to rebuild their lives, only to be told they had to fight all over again. The family packed into a bus with friends and supporters, traveling to Vacaville State Prison. It was their first parole hearing, and it was brutal. For the first time since Kina's death, they sat across from Stephen, the boy who had once eaten dinner at their table, now the man who had murdered their daughter. Mike Solano stood and told the board, "My daughter was sentenced to death forever. I ask for a fair trade. I ask you to sentence Stephen to life in prison." But Stephen had his chance to speak too. He told the board it was difficult, that he felt remorse. He framed the crime as a mistake, downplaying the obsession, the threats, and the planning. The Solanos could hardly believe what they were hearing. The parole board deliberated and for the moment sided with the family. Stephen was found unsuitable for release, but the victory was fleeting. He would get another shot at parole in just 2 years, and then another, and another. The cycle began, a cruel pattern that stretched over decades. Each time, the Solanos had to relive Kina's murder. Each time, they had to travel, testify, and beg the board not to free the man who had taken their daughter. Each time, they feared this might be the moment he walked free. By 2025, they had faced Stephen Burns in 13 parole hearings. For the Solanos, it wasn't vengeance that kept them going. It was fear. Fear that Stephen, if released, would hurt again. Fear that another family would have to suffer the way they did. Decades have passed since that September night in 1979. But for the Solano family, the pain has never dulled. Every parole hearing reopens the wound, forcing them to stand in the same fight they never asked for, year after year. But out of tragedy came determination. Kina's mother, Harriet, turned her grief into action. She founded Crime Victims United, an advocacy group that fought to change laws in California. Thanks to her work, victims' families can now deliver impact statements in court. Children testifying must be accompanied by a support person, and parents are allowed inside the courtroom, even if they're also witnesses. These reforms exist because one family refused to stay silent. Kina's sisters carried the fight too. They built careers shaped by their loss. Nina became a prosecutor, swearing that no one else's family should feel as powerless as hers once did. Each of them found strength in the promise their father had left them. Whatever it takes, protect your mom and keep Steve in prison. Stephen Burns has spent over 40 years behind bars. Over time, he admitted the truth, that he shot Kina in anger when she rejected him. But even now, in hearings, his words are flat, his tone cold. To many who have observed him, it feels like minimization, not remorse. Supporters argue that people can change, that after decades in prison, a man in his 60s is no longer a threat. They point to rehabilitation, to aging out of violent crime. But for the Solano family, the risk is too great. To them, Stephen is the same obsessed, dangerous boy from across the street, the one who could not take no for an answer. And so they keep showing up, hearing after hearing, testifying, fighting, speaking for Kina who no longer can. Because this story isn't only about a murder, it's about the ripple effect of violence. A young woman's dream to become a dentist was stolen. A family's sense of safety was shattered. A community learned that danger sometimes lives just across the street. Kina Solano was more than a victim. She was a sister, a daughter, a friend. She was the heart of her family. And through their fight, her voice has never been silenced. In the end, justice is not just about keeping her killer behind bars. It's about remembering who Kina was, and making sure her story continues to matter.